Welcome back. I'm Peter St. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Democrats just threw away one of their last weapons against Donald Trump, as Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer gave up trying to force a government shutdown. As one insider put it, quote, Chuck just handed Trump the keys. As Zero Hedge put it, it was the art of the kneel. The reason Chuck kneeled is Democrats are afraid that if they force a shutdown, Trump and Elon could use it to lay off hundreds of thousands more federal bureaucrats. Federal bureaucrats being the true base of the Democrat Party. Now, the context here is Congress did not pass a budget last year, instead limping along on so-called continuing resolutions that copy and paste last year's spending. Republicans were trying to get another 6-month resolution to fund the government until the next fiscal year budget. But Democrats smelled blood and were threatening to block the CR to use government shutdown as leverage to gut Doge. Schumer's kneel means Dems are giving up on shutdowns, throwing away one of the last weapons they had against Trump. This actually clears several roadblocks for Trump because the federal government is also up against the debt ceiling. In fact, it already broke the ceiling mere hours before Trump took office and is now scrounging for spare change in Treasury's couch cushions called, quote, extraordinary measures to get to maybe June. A ceiling also forces a shutdown, but it's a funny one because government can still spend, it just can't borrow. Now, given the federal government is currently borrowing $2 trillion a year, $1 in $3 they spend, that implies an immediate $2 trillion cut in spending, with Donald Trump largely deciding what gets cut. So you would have to cut pretty much everything outside Social Security, Medicare, and Border Patrol. To give a flavor, in the 2018 shutdown, the feds furloughed, meaning they stopped paying, 800,000 federal workers. It's about twice what Trump's targeting this year, and 1 in 3 federal bureaucrats. So while the debt ceiling is normally when the opposition squeezes the president, and Dems were very much looking forward to it, thanks to Doge, the Dems now existentially fear a shutdown, because 800,000 furloughs is a very short step to 800,000 layoffs. Now, the 6-month continuing resolution and debt ceiling were supposed to be the boss battles, Dems' great uprising against Trump and Elon. Instead, with Chuck's kneel, it looks like Dems are folding across the board to protect their Achilles heel, corrupt government workers. So what's next? The next funding fight comes in June with the debt ceiling, then September when they pass next year's budget. That will be Trump's first budget, and he wants some big, beautiful tax cuts. So no tax on tips, tax cuts for manufacturing and energy, and extending his first-term tax cuts, along with, quote, hundreds of billions in Doge cuts from the EPA, IRS, Department of Education, and, of course, the U.S. Aid Slush Fund, all set against more money for the border and military. These were supposed to be battle royales, but kneeling Chuck could mean Dems are out of cards, resigned to rubber stamping Trump, and then whining about it on CNN. Last week, Trump's based Commerce Secretary Harold Lutnick floated eliminating all income tax on anybody making under $150,000 a year. That would exempt roughly 85% of American taxpayers, about 130 million families, who would no longer be subject to an annual financial colonoscopy to pay for transgender operas in Peru. If you want the operas, you got to mail them a check. So Lutnick announced it in an interview with CBS, saying, quote, how about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, Social Security? These will change America. I know what Trump's goal is. No tax on anybody who makes under $150,000 a year. That is his goal. This would be music to the ears of those 130 million Americans who would save on average $7,000 a year in income tax. A Tax Foundation study last year estimated the average American spends 53 hours doing their taxes. So that's 7.9 billion hours a year, on top of 550 billion paid to tax preparers and accountants. Keep in mind, Americans say preparing taxes is one of the least pleasant things one can do while remaining alive, somewhere between standing in line at the DMV and dental surgery. Now, exempting 85% of Americans would reduce taxes by about $800 billion, but probably a third of that comes right back in the form of new growth. Because tax cuts grow the economy, people work harder, they expand their business, or they start a business in the first place. The new jobs and higher incomes raise government revenue, so payroll, sales, property, even tariffs. Business tax cuts actually play closer to 90% or more. The Heritage Foundation found Trump's first-term tax cuts essentially paid for themselves. Still, this is personal tax, so you're probably looking at $400 or $500 billion less going to the IRS. Now, that should be very easy to cut. I mentioned in recent videos that if we're serious, we could cut 1 to 2 trillion, the kinds of numbers Elon is floating, with zero negative impact on voters. So it all sounds great, but there is a catch, because exempting 85% from the income tax could mean open season on the remaining 15% who pay the bills and create most of the jobs. As Ben Franklin put it, quote, "When the people find they can vote themselves money, this will herald the end of the republic." Now, the truly rich can take care of themselves. They have lawyers and accountants, but almost 40% of the 13 million taxpayers between $150,000 and $400,000 a year are actually small business owners. Over half of those from 400 to a million are small business owners. These small businesses employ nearly half of all Americans, 62 million souls. So at a minimum, you want some allowance for small business. Now, Trump has floated this with his Made in America break. You could also just raise the exemption to 400 or more, or my ideal, just get rid of the entire income tax altogether, something Trump has been very sympathetic to. And eminently doable if you ditch the Senate filibuster for spending and slash round about $2 trillion in federal spending. So what's next? Donald Trump is taking aim at the foundations of Imperial Washington, the income tax, and FDR's New Deal that created the imperial bureaucracy and was built with that tax. So long as it can be designed so small business is not the last man standing, repealing the income tax for 85% of Americans will go a long ways to starving that beast. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. The European Union is scrambling to ramp up defense spending so it can start its own wars, or defend itself, with a new package totaling roughly $840 billion. This is all part of a wider plan that could ultimately confiscate 10 trillion euros, it's about $11 trillion, in bank savings from regular Europeans to dump into Europe's welfare warfare machine. Now, today's 840 is coming because Donald Trump has told Europe it has to pay for its own defense. Of course, the EU is slippery, and this is just budget authority, not dollars and holes, but if it happens, it would take EU's defense spending to close to 3% of GDP, as double today's 1.5 and very close to U.S. spending of about 3.5 to 4%. The United Kingdom, no longer in the EU since Brexit, is also raising defense spending to 2.5% of GDP. Put together and close to $900 billion. Yes, it is amazing how much spare change Europeans find in the couch when Yankees go home. The newfound seriousness is all Trump. In his first term, he had been demanding that Europeans spend between 2 and 4% of GDP. since after all, they're the ones with the security problems, and yet we defend them for free while they blow trillions on welfare states for third worlders and starting new wars on our dime. Indeed, Europeans spend between 7 and 10% of GDP more on welfare than the US, a big chunk funded by skimping on military. To give a sense how these welfare queens spend their days, a recent video made the rounds of the German military training with broomsticks because they don't have guns. In 2023, Britain announced they have just over 100 operational tanks. It's for the most impressive military in Europe. The Netherlands auctioned off their tanks 20 years ago. Spain's fighter jets date from the 1980s when MacGyver was top of the charts. The other push, of course, was Trump saying America's done with the war in Ukraine, telling them make peace or we are out. Since Zelensky's Oval Office wipeout, American public opinion has turned solidly against that war, with Ukraine support dropping 20 to 30 points. Trump's now ramping it up. The past few days, Trump publicly mulled moving 35,000 U.S. troops out of Germany and ending joint NATO exercises, which cost us $1.5 billion to train Germans how to hold guns. So what's next? $840 billion is just the start for Europe. Bloomberg estimates that a 4% GDP target on defense would require nearly $3 trillion in extra European spending in the next decade just for the 5 biggest European NATO members. The Financial Times of London summed it up. Europe will have to, quote, trade its welfare state for a warfare state. The Europeans, amazingly, are dumb enough to actually want the world policeman job that's been bankrupting our country and crippling our young men since 1945. Possibly because this is the fate of all socialist regimes, crush the economy, then distract with war, or possibly because Europeans are clinically narcissist and need to matter. Either way, the sooner the U.S. is out of Europe and out of NATO, the better. Let Europeans and everybody else clean up their own mess. Is Bidenflation finally over? Last week I mentioned Donald Trump's first inflation report came in at just 2.4% annualized, down from 5.7% in Joe Biden's last read, which is one heck of a move in a single month. It could be even bigger. A new report says real-time inflation is now just 1.35% per year. The data comes from Truflation, a real-time price aggregator that reads 30 million prices across the economy. The CPI samples just 80,000 with a long delay. The first question is, how accurate is Truflation? Since they started in 2021, they've tracked very closely to CPI, typically with 99% correlation. The one time they were way off official CPI was the height of Bidenflation in 2022, when Truflation reported 13.5% inflation, but CPI said it was only 8.5%. Incidentally, back then, I also ballparked CPI at about 12.5%, a lot closer to Truflation. Reason being government numbers undercount food and massively undercount housing, with a weird step-lagged rent extrapolation instead of just like looking at house prices. So it's driving the low inflation. Last week I also mentioned government spending and the Fed are the 800-pound gorillas for inflation. The Fed is currently deflationary between high interest rates and selling off assets. Government spending is more complicated. So Doge cuts are not in the CPI yet because the money would have still been stuffed in NGO bank accounts, only gradually paid out the rioters, or activists. In fact, federal spending is up in the last year, driven by automatic increases in Social Security and a bonus from Medicaid spending going to migrants and tax-funded gender transition surgeries, not a joke. Instead, the deflationary impetus is apparently coming from commodities, especially oil. So since Trump took office, oil is down 14% in just 6 weeks. Energy feeds into everything from food to home building. In fact, Zillow is now forecasting house prices will rise just 1.1% in the next 12 months. That's down from 12% housing inflation these past 5 years. Beyond energy, the Goldman Index of 24 commodities from agriculture to copper is dropping by 1% per week. Now, when commodities collapse, there's two possibilities: either a widespread expectation of falling costs, that could be red tape, taxes, operating costs, or the darker possibility that commodities expect a recession. This because in recessions, demand dries up, companies dump unsold goods, and debt defaults effectively reduce the money supply. So a default is equivalent to lighting the money on fire. The money supply shrinks. To illustrate, in the 2008 crisis, peak to trough, the Goldman Commodity Index dropped 73%, oil dropped 75%. Now, happily, we have a tiebreaker: commercial bank loans, because in good times, commercial loans boom. In recessions, they fail. In fact, since Trump took office, commercial bank loans are rising at 7% annualized, which is healthy. That suggests we're looking at good deflation, more goods chased by the same dollars, the kind that makes us rich as dollars stop melting like ice cream on a Delaware beach. So what's next? Inflation was the top voter concern in 2024, along with the border. The border is now all but sealed, and if Bidenflation really is finished, Trump will have fixed voters' two biggest concerns in 6 weeks flat. Next up being getting incomes growing again, where deportations and investment, those bank loans, take center stage. A word from our sponsor: one of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. China is terrified that Donald Trump could turn it into a Japan-style zombie economy. According to the Wall Street Journal, China is, quote, right to worry, because Trump's aggressive tariffs on China, with more to come on April 2nd, are hitting when China's economy was already reeling from failed central planning. With trillions of overcapacity dumped into state favorites, from green energy and EVs to semiconductors and commercial aircraft. To illustrate, by 2019, China had 500 electric vehicle makers. 80% have already gone bust, with 100 still to go. This overcapacity is crashing prices in China, which are actually falling in deflation, while estimates peg China's economy limping along at just over 2% growth, a far cry from double digits a decade ago. Ominously, after China's youth employment soared past 20%, Beijing stopped reporting it. Now, China's response to overcapacity has been dumping abroad, which is why you can get $4 shirts on Temu. That's pissing off trade partners, but it's barely making a dent, with tens of thousands more Chinese factories at risk, which would mean millions more jobs lost. Last year, China had nearly 1,000, quote, dissent events, riots. Millions of unemployed factory workers would be gasoline to that fire. Donald Trump is now feeding China's house of cards into the wood chipper. A few weeks ago, he hiked tariffs to between 17.5% and 35%, with more to come on April 2nd when Trump goes nuclear with his reciprocal tariffs. Even China permabull J.P. Morgan admitted, quote, we felt tariffs were a negotiating tactic rather than a structural change. We appeared to be wrong. Now, I've mentioned in previous videos that Trump's dream of bringing production back to America is actually possible if business taxes and red tape are tamed. Doge is aiming directly at both, while Trump wants to repeal the entire income tax. Given America's huge economy, we're 1/4 of the entire global economy. If you nestle that under a big, beautiful tariff umbrella and cut costs and red tape, you get a flood of even Chinese companies wanting to make it in America. Beijing will be bribing them to stay. Of course, it's not just Trump. Doing business in China has always been like dating a stripper. Looks good, but there's an awful lot of drama. Beijing forces you to train your competitors and share your trade secrets, so-called forced technology transfer. Its regulations change depending who you know, with foreigners at the back of the line. Occasionally, it arrests your managers as hostages if it's upset with your country. Thanks to all this, foreign investment into China has collapsed 96% since Xi Jinping took office, actually turning negative, more leaving than coming, with a record $168 billion outflow last year out of China. There's even talk that China could be turning into a Japan-style zombie economy thanks to government misallocation of capital. Bond markets say it already has. So what's next? China's President Xi appears incapable of handling the challenge. He's the most anti-business Chinese leader since Mao, with a decade of low growth to show for it. Worse, his instinctive combativeness is going to create fireworks with Donald Trump, who's currently luring China's most important ally, Russia, out of its orbit. Sadly for the Chinese people, Xi's greatest achievement is the police state he built, so at age 71, there's no cavalry coming. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to peterstandons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.